The Pacific Northwest, one of the most beautiful regions of the United States, home to rugged coastlines, deep forests, cities with character, and stunning mountain peaks and volcanoes. A hub for industry, the Pacific Northwest is the birthplace of several famous staples of American society, from Microsoft to Starbucks. Revered for its beauty, the Pacific Northwest is home to several national parks and countless scenic areas, offering a treasure trove of outdoor recreation activities. Home to 13 million people, the Pacific Northwest is growing, and it's growing fast. But under all of this hustle and bustle lies a ticking time bomb: the Cascadia Subduction Zone. The Cascadia Subduction Zone is a fault line extending just over 600 miles from Cape Mendocino in Northern California through Oregon and Washington to the northern tip of Vancouver Island in British Columbia. Here, the Juan de Fuca Plate dives beneath the North American Plate. This geologic structure is responsible for building all of the iconic landforms in the PNW, but it is also responsible for absolutely cataclysmic earthquakes and tsunamis, the most recent of which occurred on the night of January 26, 1700. Today, the Pacific Northwest is at great risk of the big one, an earthquake that could potentially register a whopping 9.3 on the moment magnitude scale, making it one of the largest earthquakes ever recorded and single-handedly being responsible for tens of thousands of casualties. This colossal earthquake would shake up life as we know it in the Pacific Northwest forever, and it's not a matter of if the earthquake occurs, it's a matter of when. In this special episode of Solomon's Outdoor Adventures, we're going to learn all about the big one, including some history of the Cascadia Subduction Zone, some geology and geologic evidence of past earthquakes, as well as future earthquakes and what it would look like in the PNW when the big one inevitably hits. This is episode 2 of SOA Cascadia, a very special mini-series. If you haven't watched episode 1, which is about volcanoes of the Cascades, I highly recommend you give it a watch. All right, well, without further ado, let's get going. We're starting with history. On January 26, 1700, at roughly 9 p.m., a catastrophic earthquake with an estimated magnitude of 9.0 struck the Cascadia Subduction Zone. The earth shook violently for almost 10 minutes, from Vancouver Island down to Cape Mendocino in California and everywhere in between. A tsunami as high as 100 feet absolutely plowed the coast, destroying Native American villages and causing a night of absolute terror for all of the native tribes, from California to British Columbia. Some tribes recount canoes being lodged in the tops of trees due to the tsunami, and every tribe in the Pacific Northwest has frightening myths and stories about this disastrous event. Some said that a thunderbird and giant whale were battling, while others swore that some clumsy guy knocked over some mountain dwarf's drum. Some people even thought some dude was running up and down the coast with super heavy feet, shaking the ground as he ran. On the other side of the Pacific, the Japanese had their own recount of this disastrous night. Just after 12 a.m. on a cold winter night, a monster from the deep attacked, striking fishing villages across the east coast of Japan. The Japanese have known for millennia to escape to high ground after a strong earthquake, but there was no shaking on this night, and a tsunami as high as 12 feet inundated the Japanese east coast. This led to the Japanese calling this event the Orphan Tsunami, as it came with no apparent cause. One particular village, Miyako, located in the Tohoku region of northern Honshu, was heavily damaged. Magistrates, samurai, and villagers documented the night, recording that roughly 20 houses in Miyako were destroyed. And Miyako wasn't the only village. Records from the magistrate of Otsuchi documenting the destruction of several houses and rice fields were sent to the Tokugawa shoguns. Thanks to the meticulous record-keeping of Japan during the Edo period, we know the exact date and time that this tsunami hit Japan's east coast, the 8th day of the 12th month of the 12th year of the Genroku era, just after midnight, or what we would call January 27th, 1700. No earthquakes in Kamchatka, Alaska, or Chile occurred at this time, leaving Cascadia as the only possible culprit of this disastrous night in Japan. Thus, geologists and historians were able to piece together the exact date and time of the earthquake that occurred in Cascadia that caused the tsunami that ravaged the east coast of Japan on that fateful night. The scientific community did not take these Native American stories and Japanese accounts seriously until the 1980s, when geologists began to suspect that the Cascadia Subduction Zone was perhaps not the aseismic fault that they thought it was. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, geologist Brian Atwater and biologist David Yamaguchi published several papers of groundbreaking research on the past earthquakes and continued seismicity of the Cascadia Subduction Zone. Atwater's research would ultimately sway the general consensus that Cascadia was indeed active and posed a tremendous threat to the lives of over 13 million in the Pacific Northwest. He found a treasure trove of compelling geologic evidence of past great earthquakes by studying two main things: the soil and tidal zones and the dendrochronology of old-growth trees in coastal areas around the PNW. Atwater found three main clues of past earthquakes: rapid land subsidence, which is land rapidly lowering; marine sand layers deposited in between mud layers in various estuaries; and sudden stress and/or death in trees in the area that corresponded precisely with land subsidence and sand deposits. Rapid land subsidence in Cascadia is attributed to the North American plate slipping during an earthquake. To understand this, let's discuss the main type of earthquake that occurs here, as well as its mechanisms. The specific type of earthquake that occurs on the Cascadia Subduction Zone is known as a megathrust earthquake. Mega because they are the largest earthquakes on the planet, and thrust because they are generated by thrust faults. A thrust fault is a type of fault where one layer of rock is being pushed or thrusted above another. Thrust faults are created by compressive tectonic forces. When two masses of rock are compressed together, one is bound to buckle beneath the other. Thrust faults are responsible for the largest earthquakes on the planet because of the immense amount of mass that they accommodate, and subduction zones are quite literally giant thrust faults. Think about the physics here. The Juan de Fuca plate subducts under the North American plate, thrusting the North American plate above it. As this happens, the North American plate crumples up and is actually being uplifted. When great earthquakes hit Cascadia, the plate boundary goes back to equilibrium as the accumulated strain is released. As such, the minorly uplifted North American plate rapidly subsides, with some areas along the coast sinking by as much as 6 feet during an earthquake. In Washington, there's an area called the Copalis Ghost Forest, where a grove of western red cedars and Douglas firs immediately died due to land subsidence during the 1700 earthquake, and this is where Atwater and Yamaguchi did much of their work. Sand layers deposited in between mud layers in estuaries is indicative of tsunamis. As the ocean rushes the land, it brings sediment along with it. This sediment is sand, and it deposits itself in the muddy tidal zones of various rivers and wetlands along the coast as the tsunami blankets the land with sand and other marine debris. Over the years, mud eventually deposits itself over this sand, and the rivers continue to flow, and the cycle repeats as earthquakes and tsunamis continue to occur. Atwater and his team scoured the entire Pacific Northwest coast from Canada down to California and found several layers of sand deposited between mud in nearly every estuary, from the tiniest creek to the mighty Columbia River. Lastly, sudden stress and/or death of trees in low-lying coastal areas, corresponding to episodes of subsidence and sand deposits in estuaries, is indicative of tsunamis and was one of the smoking guns of the 1700 Cascadia Megaquake. All in all, Atwater and his team found evidence of 40 great earthquakes within the last 9,860 years here in Cascadia, averaging out to an earthquake every 246 years. The last great earthquake to hit Cascadia was in 1700, making it 324 years since the last earthquake. Though the math works out to an average of one earthquake every 246 years, it's important to note that Atwater found evidence of earthquakes as far as 577 years apart, as well as earthquakes as close together as only 27 years apart. So what does this mean? This means that statistically speaking, you could say that the big one in Cascadia is overdue. However, averages are tricky because they're just averages. 10 is the average of 9 and 11, but it's also the average of 19 and 1. People that are way better at math than I'll ever be have done calculations to try and assign a likelihood of the big one hitting by a certain date. There's a 14% chance that a magnitude 9 or greater hits by 2050, and a 37% chance that a magnitude 8 hits in the same time frame. This means that a magnitude 9 would be a complete rupture of the Cascadia Subduction Zone, while the more likely magnitude 8 would be a partial rupture of the subduction zone, probably in either the northern section near Vancouver or the southern section in Northern California and Southern Oregon. So, what does this mean for the 13 million Pacific Northwest residents? Well, truthfully, it doesn't look good. The Cascadia Subduction Zone itself wasn't discovered until 1970, and it was thought that it was either dead or aseismic until Atwater's research was widely published and accepted in the 1990s. By the 1990s, though, it was kinda too late. Seattle, Portland, Tacoma, and other PNW cities had already been built up. Seismic code was not implemented in the PNW until 1994, so every building, bridge, house, and other structure built before 1994 is at great risk of collapsing in the event of a megathrust earthquake, totaling to literally millions of structures. One spokesperson for FEMA famously said, in regard to a Cascadia Megaquake striking, quote, "Our operating assumption is that everything west of I-5 will be toast," unquote. But what exactly does being toast mean? What does a magnitude 9 earthquake even feel like? And what do we expect would happen exactly when Cascadia goes? We're going to answer all of these questions and more. We're going to understand more about Cascadia's geologic setting by glancing at other subduction zones. We're also going to learn what a magnitude 9 earthquake means by understanding how earthquake magnitude is calculated and what a magnitude 9 earthquake would feel like. Lastly, we're going to discuss what would likely happen in the Pacific Northwest in the event of one of these magnitude 9 megaquakes. Come on, let's do it. The current scientific literature suggests that an earthquake as strong as magnitude 9.3 could occur on the Cascadia Subduction Zone. Every single earthquake above magnitude 9.0 has occurred in a subduction zone, including the deadly 2004 Sumatra earthquake, which killed 230,000 people and registered a whopping 9.2 on the moment magnitude scale. Now, you probably noticed that I said moment magnitude scale and not Richter scale. This is because the moment magnitude scale is what geologists use to measure the strength of an earthquake. The Richter scale has been outdated for 45 years. The moment magnitude scale is logarithmic, assigning a magnitude by taking log base 10 of seismic moment, or m0, minus a constant of 9.1, all divided by 1.5. Seismic moment is calculated by multiplying the Young's modulus, or rigidity of the bedrock involved in the earthquake, by the area of the fault rupture, length times width, and the slip of the fault line. The Richter scale is outdated because it failed to take a few of these variables into consideration. With the moment magnitude scale being logarithmic, increasing by a factor of 1.0 in magnitude means that total strength of the earthquake has increased by 32 times. For example, a magnitude 8 earthquake is 32 times more powerful than a magnitude 7 earthquake. A magnitude 8 earthquake is 32 times more powerful than a 6, or 1,024 times more powerful than a magnitude 6 earthquake. As aforementioned, seismologists have calculated that the most powerful Cascadia earthquake could register at a 9.3 on the moment magnitude scale, and this is directly due to the fault's length and width. The locked zone of the Cascadia Subduction Zone is roughly 1,000 kilometers long and about 83 kilometers wide on average. We could actually calculate how strong the earthquake would, in theory, be if the entire fault line ruptured tomorrow. We know that our length of the fault is 1,000 kilometers, and our width of rupture is 83 kilometers. The rigidity constant of basalt, which is the main type of rock that the Cascadia Fault cuts, is about 78 gigapascals, or 7.8 times 10 to the 10th newtons per meter squared. Now, the last time the fault ruptured was in 1700, and the Juan de Fuca plate moves at an average of 1.6 inches per year. This means that, over the course of 324 years since the Juan de Fuca plate last moved, 518.4 inches, or 43.2 feet of the Juan de Fuca plate has gotten stuck. 43.2 feet is equivalent to 13.17 meters. So, if the entire fault line ruptured tomorrow and released all of the strain that had accumulated, slipping 13.17 meters, a magnitude 9.22 earthquake would occur. This, of course, assumes that the entire fault line ruptures and that no stress that has been accumulated has been released since 1700, and the likelihood of that is actually pretty low. A more likely scenario would be a partial rip of the Cascadia Subduction Zone. Using the same equation, let's say only 520 kilometers of the fault slips, with the width of slip of 46 kilometers. Instead of 13.17 meters of displacement, let's say 5.15 meters of the built-up strain slips. Using the aforementioned equation, we get a moment magnitude of 8.59. Both of these possible earthquakes that we just calculated are in the ballpark of what the USGS and other geological organizations have calculated and expect. Now for the not-so-fun part, discussing what exactly would happen if the big one struck tomorrow. We just calculated two possible scenarios, a magnitude 9.2 full rip and a magnitude 8.6 partial rip. I'm going to dive into what would happen in the event of a full rip and not linger too much on what would happen in a partial rip, just because a partial rip would be less severe and more confined geographically. By knowing what to expect in the event of a full rip, you're effectively preparing for the worst but hoping for the best. Alright, let's set the scene. It's a hot summer afternoon in the Pacific Northwest. People are getting off of work. The traffic is absolutely terrible, a real gridlock given that everyone is trying to get home early or get out to the coast or their nearest body of water to cool down on a hot Friday afternoon. Seaside, Astoria, Newport, Ocean Shores, and other coastal towns are filled with eager fevers trying to escape the sweltering heat. Even those in Redding and Medford are headed towards the likes of Arcata and Brookings, right into the heart of the tsunami inundation zone. They're not thinking anything of it now, but they'll be thinking of it here in a few minutes. Off the coast, the Cascadia Subduction Zone has accumulated just too much stress. The fault can't take it anymore, and the strain between the two tectonic plates has reached a critical point. The entire subduction zone, from Vancouver to California, begins to slip. Before the onslaught of shaking starts, everyone gets an alert on their phones.
Earthquake. Drop cover, hold on. Shaking expected.
Geologists at the USGS and around the world are frantic as their instruments pick up the P waves of the earthquake before the S waves start shaking the ground. Some people get this alert and heed it, the precious seconds of warning saving their lives. Others see the alert and panic, not knowing what to do. Others don't even see the alert, oblivious to the disaster that is about to strike. Dogs, cats, and other animals are freaking out. They can sense the quake before the shaking starts. A cacophonous sound reminiscent of 1,000 trains roars across the land. Then the shaking starts. Oh boy, the shaking. The entire Pacific Northwest begins to shake violently. People are thrown around like rag dolls, buildings collapse, bridges buckle, and the solid ground turns to quicksand in waterlogged areas around Seattle, Portland, and other lowlands. This horrible shaking lasts for over 5 minutes, and several people are so dang frightened that they die of a heart attack right on the spot. Tens of thousands of people are crushed under rubble from millions of buildings and structures that were built before 1994. No seismic code, no chance. Utility lines burst, starting fires and spewing sewage. Several bridges on I-5, I-90, and I-84 have collapsed, marooning the Pacific Northwest. SeaTac and PDX are basically useless now, as the ground they were built upon has been subjected to liquefaction. It's basically quicksand. You can't land an airplane carrying aid on quicksand. After the shaking, people that have survived are going to need to survive for months until aid comes and utilities are repaired. Many people won't, as they just won't be prepared to live that long off the grid. On the coast, once the shaking stops, the terror has just begun. A massive tsunami is headed right towards the coast and will arrive in 15 to 30 minutes, with wave heights exceeding 100 feet in some places. Hysteria breaks out amongst those that survive the quake, and people rush for the highlands. Many people make it, but many people don't, and thousands of people across the PNW suffer a watery grave. All in all, the Pacific Northwest is absolutely ravaged after this magnitude 9.2 earthquake. Cities are unrecognizable. Buildings, bridges, houses, and even some high-rises have collapsed. Massive fires have blazed through the cities, and several landslides were triggered by the earthquake in the mountains. The land is forever changed, as some coastal areas experience up to 6 feet of rapid subsidence. Death and destruction on this scale has never been seen before in the USA, making this the worst natural disaster in U.S. history. FEMA estimates that roughly 13,000 people would die and 27,000 more would be injured in the event of a magnitude 9 earthquake in Cascadia. Personally, I think the number of casualties would be far higher than this. 13 million people live in the Pacific Northwest, including 4 million in the Seattle-Tacoma metro area and 2.2 million in Portland. The lion's share of buildings in these two cities are not built to seismic code, as they were built before 1994. Thus, they're more likely to collapse. Several bridges and important arteries are also not built to seismic code, and if they were to collapse, aid from other parts of the country would be severed. I think another important thing to take into account here is to look at past earthquakes in other places. In Japan, the 2011 Tohoku earthquake and tsunami killed 20,000 people. Japan is the most seismically prepared country in the world, and their seismic engineering is the gold standard. If the most seismically prepared country on the planet lost 20,000 people during a magnitude 9 earthquake, why would a region that is seriously lacking in seismic engineering lose less people in an earthquake of equal strength? That doesn't make sense to me. Over half of the buildings in the Pacific Northwest are at grave risk of collapsing during the earthquake. We just saw the ramifications of seismic engineering being thrown by the wayside last year in Turkey. Over 60,000 people died in a magnitude 7.8 earthquake due to buildings collapsing. I'm not saying Cascadia's buildings are as poorly designed as Turkey's, but I am saying that too many buildings in the PNW are not built to seismic code and will collapse when the earthquake hits, most likely killing their occupants. I think that Cascadia's threat needs to be reassessed so that people can be more aware of the situation, thus making them more likely to survive it. With all of that being said, please take my opinion with a grain of salt. I'm not an expert in risk management and assessment. I'm just a geologist with a YouTube channel. Though the Cascadia Megaquake is imminent, there is hope yet for those of you living in the PNW. Firstly, it's much more likely that a partial rip occurs than a full rip, and although it would still be pretty bad, a partial rip in the ballpark of a magnitude 7.6 to 8.6 would pale in comparison to the death and destruction caused by a full magnitude 9 rip. Additionally, geologists and engineers are making great strides in preparing the PNW for the big one. For example, in 2014, there were no bridges in Portland that would survive the big one, but now there are two, and the city is working around the clock to seismically retrofit all of the bridges in the area. And this isn't just happening in Portland, this is happening across the entire PNW. Buildings are being seismically retrofitted, cities are planning for disaster, and people are more and more aware of the threat that looms below. In fact, when I lived in Bellevue, I was working for a construction/engineering company, and our inspection process took the seismic risk of the area into great account. The PNW's engineering and infrastructure has the potential to be top-notch in the near future, and the initiatives are there, with people working around the clock to rebuild the cities so that they won't be leveled during an earthquake. With that being said, though, it is a race against the clock, and if the big one were to hit tomorrow, the result would be disastrous. However, if the big one continues to be staved off for more years, the PNW has a better chance of being prepared. If you live in the Pacific Northwest, I advise you to please gather materials such as food, water, batteries, clothing, and others for a bug-out kit in case of an earthquake. I also suggest devising a plan of action amongst your loved ones for when the earthquake hits. Know what to do during the shaking as well. Duck, cover, and hold on. And stay away from glass. I also recommend familiarizing yourself with the landscape you live in. Are you in the tsunami inundation zone? Are you in a liquefaction zone? What threats are near you that could collapse on you? All of this information can be found on websites like Oregon.gov and Seattle.gov. If you haven't already, please check out my last video on the volcanoes of the Cascades. It's a good one. Thanks for watching this installment of Solomon's Outdoor Adventures, and I hope you learned all about the big one in the PNW. As always, thanks again, y'all, and peace! Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Solomon's Outdoor Adventures. If you enjoy content like this, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and check out some of our other adventures right here. As always, guys, thanks again, and peace!